Historians are selective in the examples they use, and we are considering just a few key pieces of legislation. First of all, I'm presenting them in chronological order. In 1911, the Mines and Works Act prohibited strikes by black mine workers and provided a system by which qualifications needed for skilled roles were only provided to whites, with most qualifications already held by blacks removed over time. The Native Labour Regulation Act issued licences to recruiters who hired black labour from their territories in South Africa and nearby British colonies such as Bechuanaland. This reinforced the migrant labour system, whereby black men lived and worked hundreds of miles away from their home. Crucially, the creation of labour districts led to an expanded pass system, whereby all black men had to carry a pass containing their personal details, place of work, and length of contract. Movement outside the labour district was prohibited, and blacks could not break their contract. The Natives Land Act was arguably the most significant law of the segregation era. It prohibited blacks from owning or renting land outside declared reserves, which at the time constituted just 7% of the land in South Africa, and poor quality land at that. It did stipulate that the land allocated to blacks should increase, but persistent pressure from whites meant that expansion was slow, and by 1939, the reserves constituted just 12% of the total land in the country. White pressure also led to another crucial component of the Natives Land Act by banning sharecropping, a practice of tenant farming. Blacks were thus denied the opportunity to farm for themselves and sell surplus produce. Instead, they were forced into labourer roles on white-owned farms, or increasingly in mines and factories. The employment laws and the Natives Land Act meant that throughout the 1910s, black migrant labour expanded dramatically, and this increased further during the First World War. The flocking of blacks to towns and cities led to blacks and whites living together. Thus, the 1923 Native Urban Areas Act gave local authorities the power to create areas into which all blacks, except domestic workers, were forced. In time, white urban areas became gentrified, with decent standards of infrastructure and amenities. In turn, black areas were neglected and quickly became slums. To control the movement of blacks in urban areas, blacks were required to carry passes that outlined their nature and place of work. The Industrial Conciliation Act built on the Native Labour Regulation Act by implementing various obstacles that prevented blacks from striking. While the Mines and Works Amendment Act strengthened the original 1911 Act, meaning there was a clear colour bar, with whites at the top, coloured and Indians below, and blacks at the bottom. The Immorality Act was significant in that it signalled segregation within private lives, and was a foundation for many of the petty apartheid laws that followed. Prison sentences of up to 5 years could be issued to anyone caught having extramarital interracial relations. Finally, but importantly, the Natives Representation Act removed the only franchise for blacks that existed in South Africa. If you will recall from the last video, in 1910, the Union of South Africa came into being, and one agreement was that the 4 provinces could determine their own voting rights. In Cape Province, some blacks retained the vote, although they only made up about 15% of the electorate there. The 1936 Act removed this entitlement, and instead blacks were able to elect 4 white representatives who would supposedly represent them. In practice, it meant the end of black political rights. However, we have spoken about examples not wanting students to write stories, and thus considering the acts chronologically is less valuable than trying to link the acts in terms of themes. This is an essential skill known as categorization. Let's look at our acts again. We can identify 4 acts that segregated the workplace. We can also link together 2 acts that focused on separating where and how blacks and whites lived. There is 1 act that was political in nature, and 1 act that was social. Thus, we have taken our knowledge of the acts one stage further. But let's take our understanding of the acts further again, because as historians we are often concerned with cause and effect. Many examples do not focus on the segregation era acts themselves, but the impact of them on blacks. Using our colour coding, we can consider the impacts. The Natives Land Act and Native Urban Areas Act in their own ways, led to overpopulation of black areas. Housing was of a poor quality, and as overuse of water and land led to dried up rivers and a dust bowl effect in the reserves, farming collapsed, leading to starvation and malnutrition. In the 1920s and 1930s, over 20% of black children never made it to their first birthday. The Natives Land Act also led to a migrant labour system, which provides a nice link to our next category of acts. The 4 acts in green all contributed to a system where blacks were on far less pay than whites. For instance, in 1939, white workers in factories and construction could expect over 5 times the pay of blacks. Meanwhile, conditions were poor with single-sex dormitories, dangerous conditions in the mines, and regular fines. Most essays require 2 or 3 factors to be considered, so our third chosen impact relates to the Natives Representation Act, but also the Native Urban Areas Act. As well as the obvious political right, voting rights, being removed, blacks also had other political rights, such as the right to free movement, taken away. The lack of political representation was a key factor behind the growth of opposition groups, which we will consider shortly,